not need Canada." That sentence was not whispered. It was broadcast, delivered bluntly by a United States ambassador on public radio, as if economic gravity itself had been repealed. No caveats, no diplomacy, just a declaration of dominance. And it was a fatal miscalculation. Because at the exact moment Washington declared Canada irrelevant, Canada was doing something far more dangerous than arguing back. Ottawa was moving on. While the United States posture hardened, tariff threats, isolation tactics, economic intimidation, Mark Carney was landing in Qatar not to beg, but to sign multi-decade infrastructure commitments, energy corridors, artificial intelligence investment, capital measured not in millions, but in hundreds of billions of dollars. This is not optics, this is not symbolism, this is structural separation. Here is the irony that should make Washington deeply uncomfortable. If the United States truly did not need Canada, then Canada's pivot would not have triggered panic. And yet the reaction was immediate, defensive, sharp, almost desperate. Trump's strategy was simple: quarter Canada, threaten tariffs, force compliance. The assumption was obedience. The reality is divorce. So ask yourself this: why does the United States sound angrier precisely when Canada finds alternatives? Why does Washington bristle when Ottawa secures capital that neutralizes American pressure for decades? Because this was never about need, it was about control. And control has just slipped. This is not a downturn. This is not a disagreement. This is the opening act of an economic realignment, one where the United States fired the first shot at its closest ally and accidentally aimed at its own foot. To understand why this moment matters, you have to strip away the rhetoric and look at the mechanics. The United States does not trade with Canada out of sentiment. It trades out of dependence. Start with energy. Roughly 40% of refined petroleum imports used in the northern United States come from Canada, not overseas tankers, not emergency reserves, pipelines, continuous flow. Interrupt that and you are not dealing with theory. You are dealing with refinery downtime, price spikes, and immediate regional shortages. Now zoom out to electricity. Cross-border power flows from Canada account for nearly 1/10 of total electricity consumption in border states. In places like New York, Michigan, and New England, Canadian hydro is not a backup, it is baseload. Remove it and replacement power does not appear magically. It comes from higher cost sources with higher emissions and longer lead times. Then there's agriculture. Over 90% of the potash used by the United States farmers originates in Canada. Potash is not optional, it is fertilizer. No potash means lower yields. Lower yields mean higher food prices. That cost does not hit Ottawa, it hits grocery bills in Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska. This is where the economic logic becomes brutal. Modern supply chains operate on just-in-time delivery. Inventory buffers are thin by design. Marginal cost increases ripple instantly. When tariffs are threatened or even hinted at, companies do not wait. They hedge, they reroute, they lock in alternatives. And capital is the most sensitive variable of all. When investors see political volatility, they demand higher returns to compensate for risk. That means higher borrowing costs, slower projects, canceled expansions. The irony is that the United States is not punishing Canada with uncertainty, it's exporting uncertainty to itself. Meanwhile, Canada is doing the opposite. By securing long-term capital from outside the North American pressure zone, Ottawa is lowering its risk premium. Stable financing over decades flattens marginal costs. It immunizes infrastructure against short-term political cycles. This is the core misunderstanding in Washington. Trade pressure works only when alternatives are scarce. Capital coercion works only when markets believe you are stable. And right now, the United States is signaling volatility, while Canada is signaling predictability. That asymmetry is not ideological. It is economically decisive. Here is where the strategy collapses under its own weight. Trump's pressure campaign was designed to hurt Canada. In practice, it is detonating inside the United States. Start with the border states, the ones that cannot simply pivot away. In New York, manufacturers depend on uninterrupted hydroelectric imports to stabilize grid prices. The mere threat of disruption has already forced utilities to hedge with higher-cost gas contracts. Translation: higher operating costs today, higher consumer bills tomorrow. No vote was cast for that outcome. In Maine, the paper and pulp industry lives on cross-border energy and timber flows. Tariff uncertainty has frozen capital upgrades. Industry representatives have warned, quietly but clearly, that plants running on thin margins cannot absorb another cost shock. When mills close, they do not reopen easily. Jobs vanish. Towns hollow out. Move south to Michigan and Ohio. Automotive supply chains are tightly integrated with Canada. Components cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Every tariff threat compounds friction. Every delay multiplies cost. Executives are not ideological. They are arithmetic, and the math is turning hostile. Now look at agriculture, the political heartland Trump claims to defend. Farmers do not negotiate with ideology. They negotiate with soil chemistry. Potash prices are already volatile. The moment Canada signals it has alternative buyers and alternative capital, leverage flips. United States farmers face higher input costs without any corresponding increase in crop prices. That squeeze is real, and it is growing. Industry associations have begun circulating warnings that sound eerily similar across sectors. This policy introduces uncertainty we cannot price. This threatens long-term competitiveness. This risks permanent market loss. Those are not activist slogans. Those are balance sheet alarms. Here is the deeper irony. The United States assumed Canada would fold because Canada needs access to the American market. But markets are not binary. They are elastic. Canada does not need to replace 100% of United States demand to neutralize pressure. It only needs to replace marginal dependence. Qatar changes the equation because it brings patient capital, not speculative money, not hot flows. Infrastructure capital with time horizons measured in decades. Rail, pipelines, data centers. Once built, these assets rewire trade geography. And once rewired, they do not snap back. Meanwhile, United States firms are discovering that threats do not create loyalty. They create contingency planning. Suppliers are quietly exploring Mexican routes, European alternatives, Asian hedges. Not because they want to leave, but because uncertainty forces them to. This is the backfire. Trump's aggression was meant to isolate Canada. Instead, it is isolating American business from stable planning. And when executives lose confidence, they do not protest loudly. They redeploy silently. That is the most dangerous form of backlash, because by the time politicians notice, the damage is already locked in. While Washington argues on microphones, Canada is building escape velocity. This is the strategic mistake the United States keeps repeating, assuming Canada's response would be reactive, emotional, or symbolic. It was none of those. It was engineered. Start with Qatar. Qatar is not a retail buyer. It is not chasing quarterly profits. It is a sovereign capital allocator with a multi-decade horizon. When Qatar commits, it commits to structure, rail, ports, pipelines, data infrastructure, artificial intelligence clusters, assets that lock in trade routes and permanently alter economic gravity. That's why this matters. Canadian rail expansions are not being designed to feed the United States faster. They are being optimized to move resources east and west, toward Atlantic shipping lanes, Arctic corridors, and Pacific export terminals. This is not diversification as insurance. This is redirection as policy.
Energy infrastructure tells the same story. New pipelines are not just about volume. They are about optionality. Once Canada can route oil, gas, and electricity without touching United States choke points, American leverage collapses. Tariff threats become noise. Now add Mexico. Quietly, Canada and Mexico are synchronizing logistics standards, customs processing, and industrial supply chains, not to strengthen the old North American bargain, but to bypass its weak point. When pressure rises from the north, flows shift south. When pressure rises from the south, flows shift east. That triangulation is intentional. Then there is Europe. Canada has spent years positioning itself as a politically stable, legally predictable alternative to the volatility now associated with Washington. European pension funds, infrastructure banks, and sovereign funds respond to that message instinctively. They are not anti-American, they are anti-uncertainty. And uncertainty is now the United States export. Mark Carney's role here is critical. As a former central banker trusted in London and Brussels, he is not selling ideology, he's selling risk management. Canada is being framed as a safe harbor while the United States is framed, accurately or not, as a policy roulette table. This is where the phrase "Canada no longer needs the United States" becomes real. It does not mean trade stops, it means dependency ends. Once dependency ends, power equalizes, and when power equalizes, threats lose force. That is why Washington's reaction has been so sharp, because every rail contract signed in Doha, every pipeline approved without American input, every data center funded with non-United States capital removes another pressure lever. This is not Canada turning against the United States. This is Canada outgrowing the need to obey. And history is unforgiving to empires that mistake obedience for loyalty. Here is the part Washington is still refusing to confront. This damage is permanent, not because Mark Carney signed one deal in Qatar, not because Trump made one reckless statement, but because trust has a memory, and markets never forget who introduced instability first. Geopolitical power is not only about military strength or gross domestic product, it is about predictability. Allies align with you not because you are loud, but because you are reliable. Once reliability fractures, it does not snap back with a new election cycle. This is the long shadow Trump's strategy casts. Even if Trump leaves office tomorrow, the lesson learned in Ottawa, Brussels, Doha, and Beijing remains the same. The United States is willing to weaponize interdependence on impulse. That realization forces every rational actor to build redundancy. Redundancy is expensive, redundancy is inefficient, and once built, redundancy is never dismantled. Canada's shift is therefore not tactical, it is institutional. Supply chains reoriented away from the United States will not be casually rerouted back. Capital deployed into non-United States infrastructure will not be unwound. Legal frameworks rewritten to accommodate new partners will not be rewritten again for nostalgia. This is where the irony becomes brutal. By declaring "we do not need Canada," Washington effectively admitted it no longer commands Canada's choices. Power that must be shouted is power already eroding. And the vacuum does not remain empty. Russia benefits from a distracted and divided Western economic bloc. China presents itself as a stable, long-term partner to countries seeking insulation from United States volatility. Even middle powers benefit, as Canada's repositioning normalizes a world where Washington is one option among many, not the default anchor. That is the real shift. The United States has not lost Canada as a trading partner, it has lost Canada as an economic satellite. And once a country escapes orbit, gravity does not simply pull it back. This is why allies everywhere are watching closely, not because Canada is special, but because Canada is the proof of concept. If the closest ally can decouple, so can others. That is the strategic cost Washington is sleepwalking into.
Power is not declared, it is confirmed by choice. The moment the United States said, "We do not need Canada," it revealed something far more dangerous than arrogance. It revealed complacency, the belief that alternatives do not matter, that leverage is eternal, that loyalty has no expiration date. Canada did not retaliate with insults, it responded with architecture. Rail lines instead of rhetoric, capital flows instead of counter-threats, decades instead of news cycles. And that is why this moment will echo long after the headlines fade. Because when an ally learns how to live without you, your threats lose meaning forever. Even reconciliation becomes transactional. Even cooperation becomes conditional. So, here's the question Washington must answer, and the one I want you to argue in the comments. Did the United States just prove that its greatest strategic weakness is not China, not Russia, but its own belief that allies will always have nowhere else to go? If Canada can walk away, who is next? That is not a hypothetical. That is the future now unfolding.